Sponsors and attendees of the Investor Summit on Climate Risk at the UN this week are calling the event a success. Clean Sky's Susan McGinnis is live now in New York for a wrap-up on the two-day summit. Susan, one that had a big day yesterday and some very influential voices were speaking there.
Yeah, definitely 450 voices from the financial community around the world. So certainly a very influential group, Tyler. These people represent about $13 trillion in assets. So they wanted to have their voices heard, and they certainly did. They descend on this Investor Summit on Climate Risk at the UN, lasted all day yesterday, and they did make their statement. They called on Congress, they called on politicians, they called on world leaders to come to agreement, for Congress to pass very strong climate policies, and for world leaders to come to an international agreement. George Soros wrapped up the day last night there at the UN, the billionaire financier. He started out with a very somber speech. He was extremely negative on Copenhagen and what came out of it. He believes that virtually very little to nothing came out of that treaty, but he ended his speech on a very positive note, talking about the turnout at this Investor Climate Risk Summit and just the fact that there was such enthusiastic interest in being there and to have those voices heard, that this group will be able to accomplish something in getting policymakers to move and thereby unleashing trillions in investment that it will take to move the economy to a clean energy future. As the carbon counter ticked higher at Madison Square Garden, the talk across town at the UN was about risks and opportunities of climate change. Billionaire financier George Soros was among leaders here, sounding optimistic about what this gathering could accomplish.
It's really a tremendous accomplishment that you've got so many people here concerned with the issues, and I think by pulling together, we will be able to make a significant change.
The change this group is looking for the U.S. and world governments to take rapid action on carbon emission limits, policies on energy efficiency, renewable energy, financing mechanisms, and more. Climate envoy Todd Stern, in his first public comments since Copenhagen, agreed the financial community needs guidance.
You've got to get the rules of the road in place with respect to incentives and pricing and the like in order for the transformation that needs to happen to take place.
But according to these investors, the transformation has begun. The investment community isn't waiting for U.S. legislation or a binding global treaty before deploying capital into clean tech investments, although such policies would accelerate that deployment.
The best thing that can happen in terms of this unleashing of a huge amount of investment has to be a final agreement of the 193 countries, but it's not stopping investors from moving into the climate change space.
Mindy Luber is president of Ceres, which works with investors and environmental groups to bring sustainability to capital markets. She says the voice from the financial community is clear.
And what they're saying is, pass the law in the United States Congress. Let's go back at the international negotiations and get something on the books, and they'll be able to then scale up in a matter that we need to address climate change.
States are already taking action to address it.
In Pennsylvania, first of all, we have whole companies built around the cap and trade, the proper pricing and capping of carbon emissions. We also are very aggressively moving on wind and solar. So we're seeing a ton of job creation in those spaces, and proper incentives, for example, for conservation would spur job creation in Pennsylvania.
And big investors like CalPERS, the California Public Employees Retirement System, know what's at stake. CEO Ann Stausbaugh oversees a budget exceeding $330 million.
We invest for the long term over many decades. We're not an in-and-out investor, and sustainability is very important to us. Sustainability not just in our portfolio companies, but in the markets and economies in which we invest. So we are looking for a sustainable economy to protect our investments over the long term.
Now, with the private sector expected to be responsible for an estimated 85% of the global transition to a low-carbon economy, the investors at this summit are going to continue to seek clarity and seek certainty from their political leaders as they decide how and where to deploy the trillions that transition could take. Tyler?
A lot of capital backing up those voices. Susan McGinnis
Absolutely.
reporting for us live in New York. Susan, thanks again for being with us.
Thanks, Tyler.